Hello and welcome to EPG Pathshala. This is Panchanan Mahanti. I'm a professor of Applied Linguistics and Translation Studies at University of Hyderabad. Today we are going to discuss the topic macrolinguistic prerequisites to literary translation. And when a translator is translating a literary text, that person must be prepared linguistically, and that's what we are going to discuss in today's talk. When we speak, we perform a language activity, and each language activity performs at least one function. Roman Jakobson has enumerated 6 such functions, which are emotive, conative, referential, metalingual, phatic, and poetic. NIDA has enumerated 3 functions, which are expressive, informative, and imperative. No text is pure from the point of view of these functions. Each text performs all these functions, but one function must be dominant. And if a function is dominant, we say that this is the main function in this text. Texts can be divided into 2 types, such as literary and non-literary texts. The most significant difference between these two is that inherited meaning is dominant in non-literary texts, which normally conform to the grammatical and semantic rules of the concerned languages, whereas acquired meaning is dominant in literary texts, which are normally extraordinary from the grammatical and semantic points of view. There are 4 pillars of literary translations, which are linguists, literary writers, literary critics, and literary translators. A linguist analyzes different aspects of our language and therefore knows how it works. When we come to a literary writer, while creating a piece of literature, she selects certain items and patterns from the total paradigmatic repository of her language and combines them syntagmatically in such a way that it looks quite fresh and new. Viktor Shklovsky calls this process of making the known language look fresh and new defamiliarization. A literary critic, in order to appreciate a work of literature, makes herself capable of understanding the linguistics of it. A literary translator tries to decipher the semantic import of the work of the source language and then translates the source language into another language, which is called the target language. When we talk about defamiliarization, every poet, every literary writer uses language in such a way that the ordinary language looks new, fresh. I'll give an example which is, let's say, A Grief Ago by Dylan Thomas. We normally say a minute ago, an hour ago, a month ago, a year ago. But here Dylan Thomas, in the poem titled A Grief Ago, tries to measure time through, let's say, grief. Grief is actually a measurement of time. The grief may be for 5 minutes, for 5 hours, for 5 months. So a grief ago, that kind of thing. Or I can even use an expression like, I saw him a cigarette ago. A cigarette ago means how much time I have taken to smoke that cigarette. If I am in a very kind of a good mood, I may take more time to smoke the cigarette. If I'm in a hurry, I'll have to do it very quickly. So it's that is how time is measured, and it's new and it's fresh. Every literary text deviates from the grammar of the concerned language in a unique way, and that is why a literary text has a grammar of its own. Such texts are much more difficult to translate than the non-literary texts. As an example, let's take the following lines from E. Cummings' poem, Anyone Lived in a Pretty How Town. You can see that the very title itself is new and fresh because it's not used in our day-to-day common ordinary English. Anyone lived in a pretty how town. And in this poem, Cummings writes, he sang his didn't, he danced his did. They sowed their isn't, they reaped their same. They reaped their sowing and went their come. English sentence structure demands that here the items like didn't and did and isn't and these expressions must be nouns because nobody can say he danced his didn't, he danced his did. That kind of expression, didn't and did, these must be nouns. But the poet has preferred to use verbs, not nouns. That's why the use of verb in plus of noun is a deviation. To use Ziff's term, it's a good example of invention that involves extension of word classes because here the verbs have been extended to be used as nouns. Now let's discuss the difference between literary and non-literary texts and their impact on translation. If we are considering non-literary texts, the language used in it is normally in the familiar grammatical frameworks. It's used to describe events, activities, or situations, etc. So language here is just a means to achieve something. But if we are considering a literary text, it's very different from non-literary texts. Language in a literary text is used for the sake of it, and language here is both the means and the end. Literary writers have to know the existing as well as the possible resources of their languages. Normally, we believe that a literary writer breaks the rules of the grammar of her language, but it's not true. A literary writer can only extend the rules of the grammar. Let's take an example. Suppose hand has a particular meaning because it's a part of our body. Suppose somebody says that that person is my right hand. You see, right hand is an extension of the meaning hand because hand does all sorts of work, and when I say that that person is my right hand means because we work with our right hand, that person is that kind of my friend who does everything for me. So it's an extension of the cognitive meaning or the literal meaning or the dictionary meaning of words in literature. There are scholars who have also claimed that translation is a craft. There are people who have talked about it as a science, as an art. There are people who have also claimed that translation is a craft. Matching between the source language and the target language with a view to getting appropriate translation equivalence gives rise to the notion of equivalence. Equivalence can be of two types, such as semantic equivalence and structural equivalence. Semantic equivalence is tied with the content of the text, whereas structural equivalence is tied with the structure or the form of the text. While translating a literary text, the translator always tries to make the target language text not only semantically equivalent, but also structurally equivalent to the source language text. It's because the structure also expresses some semantic import, some meaning. And we can take an example that is Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Karamazov Brothers. It's a very famous novel, celebrated novel, in which we find a lot of passive sentences being used. In this novel, Dostoevsky in fact has tried to portray the picture of a society that has lost its face, because at the time the Russian society had in fact lost its face. It should be pointed out here that the notional subject in a sentence, which can be called the theme or the face, is always demoted when it is passivized. For example, let's take a sentence like Rama killed Ravana. In this sentence, Rama is the subject and it is the face of the sentence, and the object is Ravana. But when he pacifies the sentence, it will be Ravana was killed by Rama. See that the subject has been demoted to the object position in the passive sentence, and the object has been promoted to the subject position. So the use of a passive sentence attributes a difference in the semantic import to the concerned text. It's also possible to say Ravana was killed and Rama can be completely deleted. Rama need not be present in the passive structure at all. This shows that use of passive sentences are appropriate for expressing or portraying a society which has lost its face. That is why, while translating the Karamazov brothers, the translator must try to retain its passive form in the target language, besides making it semantically equivalent to the source language text. Newmark points out, and I quote, "The translator's craft lies in his command of an exceptionally large vocabulary as well as syntactic resources, his ability to use them elegantly, flexibly, succinctly. All translation problems finally resolve themselves into problems of how to write well in the target language." And for this reason, we know normally it is argued that a translator should ideally translate from the other tongue to the mother tongue, because we always feel quite comfortable, quite competent to translate into the mother tongue, not to an other tongue. The other point is that normally it is believed that if a translator is bilingual, that's perfectly all right, but it's not perfectly all right. Besides being bilingual, the translator has to be bicultural. Otherwise, he won't be able to identify, understand, and translate the cultural ethos of a text in a satisfactory manner. Because let's take an example. Before that, let me quote Oliver, who said, in order to transfer the cultural ethos of the source language text in the target language, a translator has to be bicultural and understand the cultural import of the former. Let's take an example here. The most celebrated poet, Robert Frost, my favorite poet, of course, let's take his poem, The Dust of Snow. Let's take this poem in order to drive home the point, and it will also make the point very clear, whatever we have said earlier. Let me read out the poem. The day a crow shook down on me the dust of snow from a hemlock tree has given my heart a change of mood and saved some part of a day I had rued. Here one can easily see that hemlock is a poisonous tree, and a crow, besides being black, which is a symbol of death, eats dead bodies. So it is death that relates the hemlock tree with crow. If an Indian reader not familiar with the Western culture reads this poem, may not be able to establish this link. But a Western reader who is quite familiar with that culture will be able to establish this kind of link. A normal Indian reader is likely to understand the poem in a different way. And that's why there is least possibility of going any further. But to a Westerner, it means something more. That's why if an Indian reader is familiar with the Western culture, how the death rites are performed, the poem can be understood in a better way. One who has some acquaintance with the Western cultural ethos, here to be particular, funeral rites, knows that before the burial of a dead body, a priest dressed in a black dress performs the death rites, which doesn't happen in India. In India, mostly we either go in a normal kind of dress, but in some occasions we have seen that people are dressed in white. That's why for an Indian reader to understand this poem may be a little difficult unless one is familiar with the Western culture. But one who has some acquaintance with the Western funeral rites knows that before the burial of a dead body, a priest dressed in black dress performs the death rites. Therefore, crow here is a symbol of the priest dressed in a black gown. The interpretation is possible only if a reader has considerable access to the Western culture in general and the death rites in particular. To summarize the discussion, we have claimed that macrolinguistic prerequisites are a must for a translator to translate a source language text in a much better way. It's because one must have acquaintance with concepts like stylistics, contrastive analysis, bilingualism, biculturalism, among other things, to be a good translator. If one doesn't have any exposure to stylistics, one will not understand the form of the poems, the literary texts, because we have discussed that the structure also expresses some meaning, and to elaborate on that, we have discussed the Karamazov brothers example, in which we said that most of the sentences are in the passive voice. Hence, while translating, the translator should try to retain such passive structures in the target text also. Contrastive analysis is necessary because the translator must know the similarities and the differences between the source language and the target language. Whenever there is a difference, the translator should try to bridge the gap by using such structures which should bring both the source language and the target language close to each other. Bilingualism, of course, is absolutely necessary. Bilingual competence is absolutely necessary so that the translator will understand the source language text in a proper way and put it in the target language in an appropriate way. Biculturalism is also very important, and that's how we showed that in order to translate Robert Frost's The Death of Snow, it's absolutely necessary to understand, to be familiar with the Western culture in general, to be specific, the Western death rites, in order to understand, so that it can be translated in a proper way, right way, better way. It's evident from the above discussion that translation can be compared with tight rope walking. Of course, we must bear in mind that one has to serve two masters at the same time. One is the source language text, one is the target language text, or in other words, you can say that one is the source language text writer, the other one is the target language text writer. And I needn't emphasize how difficult it is to serve two masters at the same time. So a translator's job is not at all easy. It's very difficult. Those who don't translate will understand that. And this is the reason for which a translator should not only translate, but also should have been translated in order to understand where the shoe pinches. If a translator texts have been translated, that person knows where the problems lie. And while translating somebody else's text, he should also do the same thing so that the original writer doesn't feel the pinch and feels happy to read the translated text. Thank you.